So probably by now you know the name of the book and who wrote it and who is reading it. So we'll get on with the story. Chapter 17, The Mines of Perpetua. In the middle of the night, he woke with a restlessness gnawing at the pit of his stomach. Mars lay flopped across the bed, snoring like a bullfrog. The boy curled against the wall on the other side. The confines of the wagon seemed to be pressing in from all 6 directions. It was hot and stuffy. He went out on the buckboard. There was just enough light in the sky to lend some contrast to the dark shadow of the earth. Still no stars, but a pale luminescence in the east suggested the rising of a new moon. The air outside was still and close as it was inside. Out of the blackness, he saw movement, a darker shadow scurrying across the dark ground. He could barely make out the form, a creature, shorter than a man, running on its hind legs, hunched over, its forearms reaching almost to its feet. A long, thin tail. It vanished in the darkness, and then another crossed its path from the opposite direction, and then another. Johnny heard the dry earth crunching underfoot. One of them stopped, looked at the wagon, and let out a sound like laughter, almost human, but with an edge of craziness. A glint of red flashed from its eye. In the distance, more movement. These beasts were everywhere, covering the entire plain. Johnny felt a mixture of sadness and dread. The safest place was back in the wagon, but he stayed a little longer on the buckboard, pondering. Everything is confinement. The known world, with its 4 sealed borders, is confinement. And here, outside those borders, there is a great confinement of spirit, a pressing down of the sky, like the fingers of a widespread hand always pressing down. And the body itself is a kind of prison, repressing the proclivities of the mind with its boundary of skin and bone, with its yearning for distant things. Desire conquers honor every time. He could not think these thoughts. They were not useful. He went back inside to seek the oblivion of sleep. Mid-afternoon the next day, a gauzy gray dome materialized over the northern horizon. It didn't rise like smoke, and it didn't drift like a cloud. It just hung there, a smudge from an inky thumb. And there was a sound, a continuous rushing at first, but after a while there were individual modulations, screeching and growling and the clanking of metal. Mars watched with a placid face. Johnny sensed he knew what it was, but he wouldn't say. The boy hadn't spoken. He slept, mostly his face pressed against the back wall. A few times he got up and drank some water. Once he lifted the flap and urinated off the sideboard into the dust. Except for the dark dome, the scenery was relentlessly static. But the dome grew larger with every rattle of the wheels. And the horizon drew no nearer. The ruts of the road merely dovetailed into a vortex where the earth meets the sky. Then, in the span of an indrawn breath, it changed. With the dome nearly overhead, a feature appeared in the earth, the slightest of rises, no taller than a man's knees. The wagon rattled toward it, the sounds swelled. The earth seemed to give way. Angel, the pony, pulled back her mane, whinnied, and shuddered to a halt. Before them, the earth opened out into a great round pit, as deep as a mountain is high. Clouds of black dust rose from its depths, and there were things moving far away. Enormous creatures with hinged jaws, taking great bites of rock and spewing them onto the backs of what looked like massive, lumbering tortoises. There was gnawing, growling, snorting everywhere, and puffs of smoke escaping from flared nostrils. The walls of the pit were terraced, and the roadbed itself followed the terraces down into the yawning abyss. Mars's smile was flushed with pride, as if he had dug the whole thing himself. There you have it, clear like the belly of the beast. What is it? The Black Rock Mines of Perpetua. This is where the blood comes from the blood. This is where the blood comes from, the blood that runs through the veins of this world, even your world, Clearlight. This is also the shortest road to Ironweed. If you still want to go to Ironweed. What are those animals? Those are not animals. Those are machines. They use the power of the black rock itself to dig the black rock out of the ground. Everything runs on the power of the black rock. It's a cycle, like the cycle of the trees. It replaces the cycle of the trees. Are we going to go down there? Yes, but not until dark. Everything stops then. We can pass through. They watched and waited. Mars grew disinterested. He jumped from the buckboard and started turning over the wafers of cracked earth, examining their backsides, crumbling them into dust between his fingers. The more Johnny watched, the more he saw. Indeed, the animals were machines. They did not have feet. They perambulated on broad, looped tracks that gripped the earth so the machines could do their work while hugging the slopes. The tortoises were wheeled vehicles, and once filled, they rumbled away and up the terraces out of the pit on the other side. And there were people, lots of them. So far away they were like mere specks, marching in flanks, carrying heavy objects, lifting and lowering, digging and shoveling. After a while, Johnny began to hear a rumbling like thunder behind him to the south. He turned toward it. There seemed to be a storm brewing in the southern sky, a dark cloud billowing from the horizon. Mars, look, what's that? Mars straightened and turned his gaze southward. He spoke under his breath. Oh, sweet Beazle. He jumped back up on the buckboard. We better start moving now. We don't want to be seen here on the rim. But what is it? I don't know yet, but it may be an old acquaintance I'd rather remain forgotten. It was hard to convince Angel to venture down the terraced trail. She shied and whinnied and pulled toward the rock wall. The drop was nearly vertical, and the roadbed was barely wider than the wagon's wheels. Chunks of stone, loosened by their passing, tumbled to the tier below. Aroused by the movement, the boy lifted the tent flap, and his face froze in terror. "Get back inside, kid," barked Mars. "It's a long way down." Soon they were in the shade of the overhanging cliffs where a mud nest village clung to the cornices, swallows flitting in and out. "But what about the people down there? Won't they see us?" "They won't care," replied Mars. "We're just merchants passing through. Perhaps they'd like to buy some pots and pans." The road wound through a series of tight switchbacks, and their passage set up a continuous landslide of gravel that followed them to the bottom. They reached a level place where their path cut a course toward the center of the pit. The rattling of falling rock subsided, and the sound of machines filled the air. Johnny craned his neck. It was strange to be standing at the bottom of a bowl, staring up at its rim. It made him uncomfortable, as if at any moment the earth could swallow him up. And there was something happening up on that first terrace. A cloud was swarming in the darkening sky, and now it was curling over the rim, slowly pouring itself into the pit along the roadbed. He did not mention this to Mars. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps it was just the shadow of their dust. He wasn't sure. Dust was everywhere. They continued. There were machines on the lower terrace. People were in the machines, controlling them. The rocks they dug from the cliffs were pitch black and shiny. There were piles of rocks and piles of soot, and the soot-gray dust hung sluggishly in the air. Further from the walls, the sun reappeared, but the shadows were long and the light pale. They came to a squared basin of gray water, and Mars let the pony drink from it. Pebbles scattered from a slag pile, and a small brown rabbit scampered. Mars made a sudden leap and caught the creature in his fist before it could make it across the road. With a swift thrust of his free hand, he slipped a knife from its belted sheath and pulled it across the rabbit's throat. "Look, we got ourselves some dinner." They moved on. They came to a place where there were fewer machines, and the road passed through a complex of low buildings made of large stones. There were no doors, just open square portals into darkness. An odor wafted from these openings, a stench that hardened into a knot of dread in Johnny's stomach. He glanced at Mars. The man was oblivious to it. He was talking, and he had been for some time. "They'll be stopping their ruckus soon. The power gods are afraid of the dark. The spirit children come out when they leave. We'll be in good company. Around the bend here, a good place to settle in for the night." A rock wall, higher than the wagon staves, marked the border of the complex of buildings. In the darkened hollow, Johnny heard scuffling sounds. Rats, perhaps, but it wasn't rats he smelled. Around the wall, they came to an open paved area flanked by a row of wizened and nearly leafless willows, the first living foliage they had seen in a long time. The rim shadows were moving in and the air was growing cold. Mars built a fire at the center of the paved area. Indeed, the grumblings of the machines grew softer and receded into the northern distance. Crickets began to trill softly. Darkness moved like a cloak over the world. But soon another kind of light appeared, a ghostly white illumination diffused from globes hanging from poles at the corners of the clearing. Mars skinned the rabbit and wiped the knife blade on its fur. He filleted the haunches and skewered them on a stiff metal rod. "Come on out, kid, and warm your bones. We're going to cook up this rabbit." The boy was so weak he couldn't hop down from the buckboard. He had to sit and lower himself to his feet. The hem of the tunic was wet with fresh blood, but he managed to shuffle to the fire and stand there with his hands out, his head bent down. Something whistled from the shadows, a bird, perhaps, or some other unnamed creature. The boy glanced about, his breath making little, fearful gasps. A distant wail echoed from the canyon rim. Then there was a sound from behind the wall. 3 sharp raps, like a stick on a metal plate. It was not random. Its intention was evident. "We're here. Are you there?" Mars stood to his full height. "Who goes?" he called. A short silence, then a whizzing sound. A rock flew over the wall and landed on the pavement. Mars picked it up. There was writing on it, but Johnny couldn't read it. "Ah, so you want to play a game." Mars unsheathed his knife and made a scratch on the rock. Then he lobbed it back over the wall. The boy's eyes bulged. "No!" he cried. "No! No! No!" He turned from the fire. "You shut up and be quiet. Do you want to die?" As soon as he said that, figures approached from behind the wall. Black coats. They leapt over the rim and poured from all the sides. The boy screamed. He stumbled, then lurched, struck the wagon with his shoulder, but managed to drag himself up onto the buckboard. He rolled onto the seat, grabbed the reins, and shook them wildly. Angel woke, looked around, whinnied, and then started to run. "Clear light! Stop him! He's taking the wagon!" Johnny didn't move. His heart jumped with hope, but it fell, and his blood froze in his veins when he heard the terrible pop he had come to recognize as the mocking bark of death. The pony screamed like a woman. Her knees buckled. She staggered sideways and fell, blood spurting from her belly. "Angel!" Mars threw himself forward and fell upon the pony, flung his arms around her neck, and buried his face in her mane. "Angel!" The boy tumbled from the wagon, picked himself up, and set off running, his legs tapping some mysterious source of energy. But he didn't get far. There was another pop, and he was lifted up, his arms flying, a crimson fountain bursting from his chest. He landed face first in the dust. The black coats swarmed past, leaping over the fire, over the fallen pony and the weeping man. They grabbed the boy under his arms and dragged him forward. It didn't take long. They had gotten what they came for, and in their departure, their voices set up a low murmur, eerie, rhythmic chant-like, and strange syllables, almost the sing-song of children. And then they were gone. Only the trampling of their receding footfall, the vibration of their voices. Mars looked up. His arms and chest were soaked with the pony's blood. "Cowards!" he cried in a ragged voice. "Cowards! Only a coward will fight with a gun." He turned and looked at Johnny. "We'll never get to Ironweed by the fourth moon now." A change crossed Mars's face. For a moment, all emotion drained out of his eyes, and then suddenly something else flooded in, something like astonishment or perhaps total surrender. At the same time, a sound, a thundering rumble, approaching with great velocity from behind the wall of the complex of buildings. Johnny spun around just in time to see the hooves of the first horse appear. Then another, horses, enormous, terrifying, pouring out from behind the wall. Some shrieked and reared, others lowered their heads and pressed forward with fierce intent. They fanned out and filled the open space, yet still more and more arrived. Mars screamed and fell prostrate on the pavement, his hands extended in supplication. Johnny edged closer to the wagon. A human voice rose above the rumble. A string of trills, yelps, and ululations. Flanks and manes parted for the entrance of the great black steed and its rider. She was as Johnny remembered her from the distance, but now she was here before him. Her hair was a kind of liquid power that poured in braided locks across her shoulders. Concentric auras of color encircled her bare breasts, and tattooed briars resplendent with rosebuds draped her shoulders and wound around her strong, sinewy arms. In one hand she held a heavy wooden staff twined with vines and small green buds. Her face was fierce and fearsome, yet softened with tenderness and an indescribable beauty. The spiral of horses slowly subsided around her, and over them fell a circle of hush. All faces turned inward to the elements at its center, the wagon. Johnny pressed against the canvas, the dead pony, Mars lying prone on the pavement. The woman goaded the steed forward at a sauntering pace until its hooves straddled Mars's outstretched arms. Between these arms she planted the blunt end of her staff. "Why do you grovel, Mars Beacon? Get up and show me your sorry face." Mars pulled his arms in toward his body until he was able to lift himself up. For a moment, he knelt before the horse, his bloody hands clasped, his face a mixture of reverence and despair. But then his expression changed. His eyes hardened, his jaw set. He dropped his arms and stood shakily to his feet. "We don't have any more business together, Mab. Our paths have diverged." The woman eyed him. "Well, at least you've got one part right. Our paths have diverged. But we still have business. Who is this man you've brought along?" Mars spoke without turning into Johnny's direction. "His name's Jimmy Clearlight. His woman has been captured by the Blackcoats. I'm going to help him save her." Mab coaxed the horse toward Johnny. Her eyes pierced him. He knew only one thing. If he had to speak to her, his voice would permit him nothing but the truth. She turned back to Mars. I heard what happened at Ladyland. I went there. I talked to a girl. Her name was Flora. She said your friend was hiding something, but not very well. The woman turned again to Johnny, and he felt a chill rise from the base of his spine to the back of his neck. What's your name, young man? Johnny. And your other name? Arcane. She was quiet for a while, her face closed inward. She spoke softly. As I thought. Then suddenly her body snapped to attention and she leapt from the horse's back, her feet striking the pavement with barely a sound. We've got to sweat. All of us. Johnny Arcane, help me move this fire. Johnny gasped in disbelief as the woman threw wide her arms and scooped up the fire into them, cradling the glowing coals and the flaming logs against her bare skin as if they were no more than a bouquet of roses. A few embers slipped and fell to the ground. Get those, Arcane, she commanded. Johnny glanced around and caught sight of one of Mars's deep pans hanging from a peg on the sideboard. He grabbed it and started sweeping the coals into it with his hands. He couldn't move fast enough to keep his fingers from being burned. On the other side of the willows was a low, rounded brick structure like a pottery kiln or a slow roasting oven. Mab threw open the door and hurled her fiery load inside. Johnny did the same. Take off your clothes, she commanded. All of them.